Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 2021 Transboundary Grassland Partnership Workshop. Yesterday, we had a set of great talks speaking to us about really a big global perspective on grasslands, and we looked at the whole Northern Great Plains. We looked at the Grasslands, Central Grasslands Roadmap, and we heard from the Natural Resource Conservation Service in the United States looking at the Great Plains Initiative and multi-species at risk in Canada. Today, what we want to do is dive down into our local landscapes. We have one example from each jurisdiction, Montana, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, that is going to give us a really great example of how we can put local action to work on the ground and actually get things done with local communities. So I'm really excited for the lineup today. And before we get going, I just want to reiterate that we in the Transboundary Grassland Partnership respectfully acknowledge that we live and work in the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. I sit in Glasgow, Montana, which is on the Milk River, and the Transboundary Grassland geography in Montana is on the ancestral lands of the Niitsitapi, and I'm gonna completely butcher these pronunciations, so I do apologize. The Ktunaxa, the Métis, the Assiniboine, and Oceti Sakowin people, and within the present day nation of the Blackfeet, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes. They have worked to protect these landscapes and the life that these areas sustain. So the first talk that we have this morning is from the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance in Montana. And Martin Townsend is going to be talking to us about ranching, conservation, and communities, a winning team. Now, Martin serves as the conservation coordinator hired by Pheasants Forever to coordinate the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Conservation Committee. Martin grew up in Manhattan, Montana. He went to college at Northwest College in Powell, Wyoming, and finished his agricultural education degree at MSU Bozeman. I have the privilege of working alongside Martin and the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance in this great partnership almost every day, and really impressed with everything that they've done lately. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you guys. With that, take it away, Martin.
Thanks, Marissa. So as I get my presentation pulled up, like Marissa said, my name is Martin Townsend. I work here at Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, and I run the conservation side of what the group does. Okay, great. So Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is based in Malta, Montana, which is extreme north-central Montana. Our conservation work exists across Blaine, Phillips, and Valley counties. That would be the main towns and cities of Glasgow, Malta, and Chinook. The mission statement of Ranchers Stewardship Alliance is ranching, conservation, and communities, a winning team. We exist as a group that really focuses on trying to find ways to help ranchers find ways to win. That winning team idea is how we approach everything that we do, conservation included. Who we are is really key to what makes us successful as a locally led collaborative. We're a rancher-led board that operates in a partnership network with involved partners in this area. The board members above are all ranchers or directly from ranching families and serve as the final decision makers on anything we do. Through our different committees and programs and events we put on, there's a lot of other partners and other interests involved, but the final say of any action we take is directed by these local ranchers. What we do is try to build partnerships that provide enhanced knowledge and education to local landowners and managers. We facilitate educational opportunities to provide landowners with information and technical assistance to be better at managing grasslands. We feel that providing that information and providing those resources leads to improved wildlife habitat, with a lot of our focus being on grassland birds and big game migration. We bring people together as a community. Our conservation projects, our educational events serve as huge influxes of both people and funds to the local economy. Our last few in-person events have been 60, 70 to over 100 people, which most of them are coming from out of town. We bring people into town, we bring outside speakers in. We try to really rotate through the kind of expertise and events that we're bringing to the area for a broader perspective on conservation. We improve grassland ecosystems with grazing practices. For us, conservation exists where grazing starts. Grazing and conservation can go hand in hand, and we look to do projects that are that win-win, where ranching and conservation and community can all thrive together. Our main focus is keeping ranchers ranching. So if we can exist to help generational transfer and bring in new and beginning producers into a very community-based and long-standing stable relationship of conservation and ranching, that is what we consider a win. We feel that that will lead to healthy and vibrant communities for the long term that have a strong economic presence as well as a strong conservation and sustainability presence. The unique thing about how RSA works is it's a hub of partnerships. RSA can exist as the local source for information between all of the different conservation partners that we might work with. So through our different programs and tasks, such as education and conservation, we're working with a lot of different agencies, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, and other interested groups that also work in this area. With north central Montana, as we're all aware, this area is one of the most intact grasslands in the world. We have a lot of conservation focus from these other groups. So instead of forcing a landowner to go seek out each of them independently to see what they might offer, RSA exists to pull in what they have to offer and bundle it all as a partnership package back for ranchers. So we work with groups like the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the Bureau of Land Management, and Marissa with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, down to my job is supported by Pheasants Forever. We received some project funding from Ducks Unlimited. We work with the Extension Service for resources and education. We really try to build relationships with each of those organizations so that we can show and enhance, really win for both them, us, and the ranchers we're working with. So our conservation committee, the entire structure of RSA is a committee-based structure. So every program that we operate has a committee of involved board members, partners, and local ranchers that support the work to facilitate those programs. The Conservation Committee is one of the longer standing and more successful committees within RSA. It started in 2017 with our first grant award and has carried on since then. So just from numbers for what we did last year, in 2020, we put out almost $200,000 for on-the-ground projects across Plain, Phillips, and Valley counties. With that, we worked on almost 30 miles of wildlife-friendly fencing, over 4,000 acres of seeding marginal cropland to grass for grazing, and then at least 5 new grazing systems that added 10 new tanks and almost 4 miles of pipeline across at least 5 different properties. Since that 2017, we have worked with now, as of this year, up to 54 different ranches and impacted over 70,000 acres. Through those grant funding and different funding opportunities that we've had, we've been able to add over $3 million into our local economy. And I think the fact that we're the most proud of is through that $3 million that we've received and then turned back out, we've been leveraging that investment at a rate of almost 5 to 1 between other partnership inputs from the partners we work with, as well as in-kind and cash services from landowners that we're working with on projects. And we do that through the partnerships and the relationships we have built with people. The people are really what make RSA function. This is a group photo of a bunch of our board members and a bunch of our conservation partners from, we had the statewide Montana Range Tour in Phillips County this year, and it toured 2 of our board members' ranches and looked at a few RSA projects as well as some NRCS and BLM projects along the way. Having these people come from all over Montana, as well as our local ranching board members, come together to view projects and really spend 3 days talking about how to be better, is the mission wrapped up in one event. If we can have those relationships working with people, we can have more and more resources and information coming to ranchers trying to conserve grass on the ground here. So our projects, I mentioned before, our 2 main project areas focus around grassland conservation for the benefit of grassland birds, as well as big game migration for migrating big game animals, mostly pronghorn and mule deer. Across Blaine, Phillips, and Valley counties, Malta would be right in the middle of Phillips County. Marissa is right in the middle of Valley County. And then we work over to the west in Blaine County as well. This is where basically the Northern Great Plains meets the Prairie Pothole region. So we have a lot of high value habitat for those different animals. So if we can help conserve the best habitat that's left in the world for a lot of these species, we feel that's a win for wildlife. And if we can help ranchers be better grass managers, that's great for ranching as well. And both of those together wind up as a great win for the community. This is a few sets of pictures of projects we've been involved in. We've worked on some fence modifications for big game migration. That's two of the pictures in here you can see. We work extensively to facilitate grazing for the standpoint of if grass is set up to where it can be grazed with fencing and stock water, it's less likely to be converted to farmland. So those two main kind of project areas are most of what we do. And we've become very good at that. And that was recognized by our partners to us, which was a great honor. We were awarded the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Mountain Prairie Regional Directors Partnership Award in 2020, which was a great recognition for our board members and our group to receive. And then we feel that conservation work is a great start, but the support behind it is what it really takes to be a long-standing and successful organization. So now I'm going to go through some of the other things that we do as part of the group. Like I said before, everything we do is a committee structure. So another committee we have is the Education and Workshop Committee. This committee works to put on educational events that support ranching knowledge. We spent a few years doing in-person events in Malta, trying to get people from the surrounding counties to come. And then last year happened and we had to pivot what we do quite substantially. It turned out to be a huge opportunity for us. We switched to more of a webinar model of sharing that information, and we went from having in-person events of around 30 people to online webinars of well over 100 people. We had subjects this past year ranging from agriculture economics to soil health to cattle selection and drought resilience. Our webinar series is something that we're going to keep doing. We have them planned out for the next year. We have one coming up soon. All of them are recorded and pasted to YouTube after they're done. We're seeing that most of them have as many views in the first week after the fact as they did while we were doing them. So we feel they're super effective. The upcoming things we're going to have, we did a book club last year where we went through For the Love of Soil by Nicole Masters. And at the conclusion of that, we had Nicole Masters here for an in-person event. We're copying that method this year, and the group is going to be reading Nourishment by Fred Provenza, and that will be followed up with trying to have Fred Provenza at an in-person event sometime next spring. The webinar series can be found on our website. We're super excited about it. And our biggest positive that came out of it last year was that we grew our outreach audience by more than 400 people in 1 year. Our communication and outreach committee exists basically to create the content that goes along with the education and the conservation that we're doing. If we can produce videos, outreach, and other materials that can be spread to a wider audience, we feel that's a great thing for us. We produced a few videos highlighting some different RSA projects and efforts, one of which is being shown here with Riley, our video guy, filming the tower setup for one of our board members' virtual fencing project. He has a project where he has basically collared cows. It exists kind of like the virtual or the yard fencing for dogs, the Invisifence, but for cows, that operates on a satellite system of collars that run from these basically cell towers. With the help of some partners, produced a video on that. We produced a video on what RSA is in general, and then we're working to highlight ranchers that we're working with, and especially the ones that we asked to speak at our events. Our fundraising committee, we are a nonprofit that struggles to function as a money-making enterprise. So we have to have a fundraising committee to keep the lights on and keep going. Our conservation and a lot of our staff is grant funded, so we do have to find ways to support that through private donations and other fundraising. So we have a committee dedicated to that. And then expansion committee, a huge portion of the mission of RSA is trying to replicate the power of locally led conservation and locally led collaboratives. So through the expansion committee, we're working with other upstarts that we know of around the area to help them get through the basic start of starting a nonprofit, starting the organization, tackling the hurdles we all know they're going to face to get up and going. And our biggest success there is we've worked with a group that's on the south side of the Missouri River called the Winnet Aces. That group is very similar to RSA, and we've had a lot of work directly with them through their startup. And then for us being so geographically close in the scope of Montana, but still 3 hours apart for a quick drive down to the next town. Trying not to overlap so much and compete for the same resources, and rather work together to do more for both of us. So that expansion committee exists really to help people get up and going, and then to be successful faster. And then our beginning rancher committee. The goal of this, like I mentioned before, is to really help new and beginning ranchers view and feel and know that they can do it. That if they're going to take the jump to start ranching, that there's resources out there to support them in this area. So this group works extensively to put on both education events as well as offer resources for new and beginning producers. We stole the TEDx model of having younger, successful ranchers that we know across the state of Montana basically come in and present on what they do and how they got there. We had that as an in-person event in Malta a couple weeks ago. We actually sold it out in under a week of advertising it and ran out of room for the banquet room of the golf course in Malta. It was a great event where people got to see that as long as you're focused on being better, that it will work for you. So that was a great event to see those ranchers really focus on how to get through the struggles of starting. And I think that's what this group exists to do, is to acknowledge that there will be struggles and to try to help provide the resources that get people through them. The Grass Bank Committee. A lot of Ranchers Stewardship board members are based in South Phillips County and have had the benefit and experience of being involved with a grass bank that the Nature Conservancy operates. In the early 2000s, the Nature Conservancy bought a 60,000 plus acre ranch in South Phillips that actually was kind of the catalyst to start the group. It created a tremendous amount of fear among the group of non-local interests coming in and buying land that's really only continued throughout time. But local ranchers were able to work with the Nature Conservancy as it was starting in South Phillips, and were able to work out a system where the Nature Conservancy would allow them as a group to collectively graze summer grass in this grass bank model. But in exchange for a reduction in lease rate, the Nature Conservancy then asked those ranchers to perform conservation on their own ranch. That model has been immensely successful for the Nature Conservancy, and a lot of our board members are involved in that and see the benefit of it. So there's a huge interest among our group in seeing that model be replicated. Our group, as well as that Winnet Aces group that I mentioned before, have collectively come together on this Grass Bank Committee, really with the goal of trying to find ways to open up opportunities for grazing so that new people can expand and grow their operations to begin ranching. The idea there is opportunity might be one of the more limiting factors for new ranchers to start. So this group is actively working on business models, feasibility studies, lease scenarios, management scenarios, and other business planning operations to see how operating a grass bank model of grazing opportunity would function being run by the two nonprofits of RSA and Win It Aces. Through some of our last grant funding, we were able to hire a coordinator and planner for that effort. And she's working with those groups extensively to really go through what the groups would like it to look like on the ground. The idea that some other nonprofit would come in and run it has kind of gone out the window. So the plan then is to have RSA and Win It Aces really have what they want it to look like on the ground nailed down for when the opportunity presents itself. Again, that's the main things of what we do. Ranching, conservation, and community is a winning team. That is something that all of us here truly believe in and truly try to do. Really, the big summary that I think I'd leave this group with is that if you can help people find ways to win, they will help you win. So really focusing on that locally led collaboration between different conservation groups is a huge way for every group to do better, and better yet, a better way for ranchers to do better at conservation. So I guess with that, I would take any questions. And that was all I had for a presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Martin. Thanks for all the good work that you do. So we have quite a bit of time for questions and discussion. Unfortunately, I think we'll have to do it through the chat because I don't think we can unmute for discussion, but please type your questions in. And let's pick Martin's brain while we have him. And I have to apologize, I got in such a hurry to introduce Martin that I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Marissa Sather. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Private Lands Program, and I'm, as I said, based in Glasgow, Montana.
I glanced over it. We work extensively with Marissa as kind of the main contracting partner on a lot of our contracts for conservation work.
So I guess I can ask you a question, Martin. What would you say was the biggest obstacle into getting RSA off the ground to where they are today from where we were, say, maybe 5 years ago?
Yeah, so absolutely it was capacity. For the first 18 plus years of RSA's existence, it was a volunteer organization with those ranchers on the board, completely running their own nonprofit. RSA didn't hire any staff person until 2017. They had a little bit of an issue with kind of upstart and turnover after that of trying to find the right people. Since 2017, though, we're now up to really 5 employees, 4 part-time, and then myself as a hired-in partner full-time. And through that time, we've expanded. We've added, call her a project lead, but really she's our communications and like brand director. We have a grants and finance person, and she happened to formerly be a federal grant auditor, and now she runs our federal grants. So that's been a huge find for us. And then we've had some other part-time help with updating filing and really trying to get us caught up in the virtual world. So capacity has been the biggest struggle, and then funding that capacity has been the second biggest struggle. There's a question in the chat. Maggie asked if RSA is able to engage most of the ranchers. Then I lost it.
Here, I'll read it to you.
Okay.
Maggie asked if RSA was of to engage most of the ranchers in your area, or are there holdouts that just aren't interested in collaborating or doing conservation or don't want to be bothered?
All of the above. There's definitely holdouts that don't want to be involved in conservation. I think the power of our group is, say we have people that don't want to be involved with one of our federal agencies, we can put them in touch with either a nonprofit or a state agency that might also offer a solution. If we have a producer that has had history that they didn't like with, say, the state Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, we can direct them towards a different group that might have a solution for their problems. So I think the ability to be flexible and to have other options has been huge for us in gaining those people, and to really be transparent about those options with people, I think helps. And then, yeah, we definitely have the people that aren't interested.
Yeah, sometimes it seems like there's just always going to be those people. we figure about 20% just never want to work with us, probably, which is fine. So we have another question from Marianne. Can you give more examples of how you support other upstarting groups in the area?
So we've looked into the idea of like being a chapter-based organization of new groups. Could be a basically subsidiary of RSA. We've done things within it, Win It ACEs, like master services agreements on education events where we will pay for the education event to happen in their area as long as they agree to run it. We've done a lot of things like that. We've kicked around the idea of doing shared positions and shared projects. I kind of mentioned it, like that Win It group. We're really only one town with a bank away from them, but they're 3.5 hours from where I sit to drive there and be at one of their meetings. So we haven't found a great way for staff to do both, but we've provided framework for like what my position does here has been somewhat copied into a similar position there. They have an education position that they just added there that we're looking to 100% copy up here. So really it's the openness of sharing resources is the main support that we try to offer those new groups.
And if I remember correctly, I think there was a lot that RSA did as far as getting their nonprofit status and a lot of the legal background.
Yep. Yeah, it took RSA 5 full years to receive their nonprofit status.
That they really helped that Win It group go through. So just providing that resource as well has been useful.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Rebecca, make sure I'm not skipping anyone here. Did you get that?
Sorry, I had a lag there. I'm gonna try to stop sharing my screen and see if that helps. The support system for ranchers is something that we highly value. We know that long-standing relationship is what's going to keep conservation on the ground long term. As far as new ranchers, of our 56 plus projects, I'd say around half are with producers under 40. I think myself and like Marissa and the other partner biologists that we work with, I think definitely do our best to find ways to help those beginning producers with really whatever they ask. So trying to help them first and foremost, I think is key for our partners and ourselves, which I think has led to around half or maybe a little less of our projects being with new and beginning producers. As far as our education events, I would say definitely half of our attendance at those education events is younger and beginning producers.
Okay, great. And Keel asks, what metrics are used to determine success, habitat outcomes, bird friendliness index, etc.?
So I'll give a general answer and then I'll actually let Marissa give the real answer. So every one of our projects is actually a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service private lands agreement. And as part of that, as a final closeout, there's monitoring that takes place on grassland bird abundance that Marissa really handles. And then for our big game work, we work with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and they have some basically pre-science and then some post-science that's going to look at some collar data on pronghorn antelope to see how they're interacting with fences, as well as some camera data that I'm slowly going through. We have one camera pointed at the highway that gets about 10,000 pictures of cars a week, but that's the general thing. For RSA, really the success is the funding that we can interject into our local economy and the number of people that we can help reach and retain. So our statistic there where we grew our communications audience by 400, that's probably our most favorite win to date. But Marissa, would you want to elaborate on our conservation and wildlife outcomes a little more?
Sure, yeah, it's always a challenge to really measure effectiveness of habitat interventions, especially when we're in a really large intact landscape where we have high wildlife values already. A lot of times the framework that we're in is losses averted versus increases. So that's a little bit of a different monitoring framework, but we do really try on any habitat intervention, be it restoration, grazing system enhancement, or anything else that we're doing, riparian mesic area. We're trying to at least measure songbird response on a proportion of those. We're limited by capacity to actually get to all of them. Working on some other ideas there too, but we've been sort of piloting a monitoring project on grassland birds on projects since 2016, really ramped up in the last few years. So we have 5 to 6 years of data from some project sites, 2 or 3 from a lot more. And what we're seeing is a really good response from Sprague's pipit, chestnut-collared longspur, and Baird sparrow to both the restoration and grazing system enhancements. The one trouble bird we have is the thick-billed or McCown's longspur, that we're actually seeing a negative trend when we seed things back to grass because they're using the cropland to nest in. And when we seed it back to grass and it grows nice and tall and lush, then they're gone. So that's something that we're working on as well as far as monitoring. But yeah, it's tough, and I think what we're trying to do is make sure that that's not happening, that we're not causing decreases in things. So that is a red flag to us that we need to be doing some more research on that species, which we are doing there. And then as far as expanding capacity of monitoring, it's always a challenge because there's relatively few folks around that can cover a lot of ground to get out at 7 a.m. in June to do bird surveys. So something we're looking at is transitioning to acoustic monitoring if possible. I know Barry Robinson up in Canada is working on that as well, but that's something we're really looking hard at, is putting out acoustic recording units and then figuring out how to glean our monitoring data from those. Okay, so next question, Benjamin asks, how big of a deal is grassland conversion to annual cropland, for example? Is most of the grazing land privately owned apart from NCC tracts?
Yeah, so the makeup of the counties we work in is around 1/2 public land. So that land, for the most part, outside of some of our state tracts, is absolutely required to stay in grassland and grazing. So our big issue really then turns into the private land. That's really the land that has any flexibility for change. Of the threats to grassland birds and sage grouse, land conversion is really the only applicable one here we have, besides like mesic and wet meadow degradation. So land conversion still takes place in these counties at a very high level, especially on higher commodity price years. So finding the ability to incentivize it in grazing is huge for us. Like I said before, there's a much higher chance of land staying in grass if it is set up to be grazed. Most of the, we have in the United States, we have the CRP program, which worked through the Department of Agriculture to take cropland and plant it to grass for soil erosion reasons. And those are 10+ year contracts. The issue that really started the first grant award of the Conservation Committee was we had, I think, 1 million acres of that coming out in the state of Montana in 2017. So trying to make sure that those acres that probably were cropland due to the fact that they lacked grazing, water, and infrastructure, if we could invest in them to add that grazing infrastructure, they would have a higher chance of staying in grass. And so far, those projects that we've been a part of, once they're in a project with us, enter into basically a new 10-year agreement of staying in grass. And then I think we're seeing a lot of success of those croppable lands staying in grass, mostly due to the cost of farming and starting into farming, as well as the benefit and ease of just letting it be grazed since it's already in grass. We do have, I'd say, quite a bit of an issue, especially as we move west with those long-standing grass tracts that have a farming history that can't be farmed being sought out and prioritized for organic farming. They would be immediately eligible for organic certification. So I know in Blaine County, that's a huge struggle and focus of trying to work with people to keep that grass in grass while there is a high demand for those tracts to be put into farming. So that cropland conversion, I think, is our largest grasslands threat in this area.
Great, thanks. So another question from Adam. When working with ranchers, do you find resistance to seeing conservation as part of the future, or is it more about filling a void where it's more about education?
So for us, I think it's how we define conservation. I think ranchers are honestly kind of hurt at the idea that someone thinks they aren't doing conservation. For the most part, most ranchers know and feel that they are providing an environmental service through ranching. They just might not define it the same way that a very wildlife focused nonprofit might. So I think finding that common overlap of what they view as good for the world and what conservation groups view as good for the world is a great place to start. And I think finding really that common definition is the first start, instead of focusing on like how they can improve, like really building on what is going well on that ranch that is good for conservation, and then asking what more they need to do to make their business better, and then trying to find ways that making their business better also makes grassland habitat better, which in grazing based systems is really usually the only option. If it improves grass quantity, it usually improves grassland habitat.
Okay, great. So Keel asked, what proportion of the range is in the hands of people who are not interested in conservation?
That's a widely variable question. I think there's definitely a lot of very, very cow-focused ranches that don't view their world that holistically, and I think that's a lot of our education and most of like communications content is to really, really define and show that those businesses still have conservation value just by the fact that they need the grass to exist, and most of these species need grass to exist. So it's not that they're not interested in conservation, it's just that they haven't really seen it defined that way as part of their ranch.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And I would also add that, you know, the real threats when it comes down to it is actually converting it from grazing land. So, you know, for most of these species, they'd much rather have grazing land in really, really poor condition than cropland or suburban houses or oil and gas wells or whatever it might be that's not grazing land. So
yeah, there's one of our wildlife program focused researchers would argue that there is no conservation difference between the worst rangeland and the best rangeland, because as long as it's rangeland, that's still pretty good.
And speaking of that, there are a couple comments on my thick-billed McCown's longspur comments that they do like dirt. They do indeed like dirt and bare ground. And Maggie commented that cropland might actually be a trap for them. So very good comment, Maggie. We actually have a master's student finishing up at Montana State right now looking at that exact question in North Valley County. And preliminary data is that they're doing just fine nesting in cropland, which really surprised all of us. But I guess we'll wait for her full analysis to see. And we'll be following that up with some research, because she was just doing basically a parent nest survival, not looking at sort of season-long or lifetime success. So there's a lot more questions than answers on that at this point. But thanks for the comment, Maggie. And Keel says, thick build like dirt. Rebecca also asked that I mention restoration projects. So could we elaborate a little bit on the restoration projects and describe them?
Sure, yeah. So we have done thousands of acres of grass seedings on marginal cropland. Some of Marissa's former work actually worked to find soil types that were less suitable for cropland and identify those. And then we've worked with NRCS and then with World Wildlife Fund as well to find those areas where those marginal soils exist but have tracts with a cropping history, and prioritize those to be either restored or incentivized into grazing through stock water additions. So we have more options to seed cropland than we do anything else. As far as programmatic options, every partner we work with for the most part has some option to do grassland restoration. So it's really just finding the option that works best for the producer. Most of our funding mechanisms have different rules on like % native composition or species composition or length of contract or partners involved or process and length of developing a contract. So going through those 6 or 7 different options with people and trying to find the one that's best for them is the first step. We do have some issues with establishment weeds issues and basically length to where from the date of seeding till that grass is ready to be used. We've had, I started here in 2017, so that's I'm going on my 5th summer, and 3 of them have been so droughty that we really struggle to get grass to grow. So that can be a hang up and an issue on having these projects be successful and less expensive. So I know when I was an NRCS partner biologist, we had a few projects that we had to reseed a couple times before the right moisture was in place to kind of catch and get grass growing. So that is a challenge in those projects. But I think a huge step in planning for those projects is once people recognize that they're losing money farming those acres, or would be losing money to update their equipment, or would be losing money to change their management to keep farming, I think there's a huge opportunity for them to add grass. It's just working through the parameters on what's going to work both for them and the partners.
Yeah, and I would just add there that it's we're truly still in a learning process as far as the technical skills on restoration. We're looking harder at some soil health and soil biology aspects that might help explain, you know, when we're having more and less success with our grass seedings. And I worked on a project this year where we already knew going into it that it was going to be a drought year, and we're like, well, we don't want to throw really expensive seed at this one, so we ended up just throwing a cover crop seed at it to get something growing, and it took off and went crazy. And so I'm really hoping that that's going to set us up well for next year. So we're looking at a lot of different things, trying to get soil health back on the right track prior to sticking an expensive set of native grass seed in the ground. But yeah, still learning on that.
And as we work with those acres, usually by the time somebody decides they could go back to grass, they're so degraded they barely grow crops anymore. So they're baseline low productivity of cropland, and then most of our programs are looking for more and more native seeds, which have a higher risk of failure to establish. So it's a fairly high risk undertaking to get both of those things to work well at the same time.
Yeah, and I see Rebecca asked a follow up too that about soil health assessment, and I think that's something we really need to get better at, is doing the right testing. And so let's just say that's an area we're still working on. All right, and then let me see. I think Ian had one here, or no. Glenn, is there any interest from renewable energy companies or others to establish large-scale solar farms in your area? If so, are there any restrictions that would mitigate the development of such farms?
So I've always heard that our reason why we don't have more solar and wind farms is the distance that they would have to go to hook up to a transmission line that isn't at capacity. Like we have the Fort Peck Dam, but those transmission lines are maxed out. So our area isn't huge on that because it would be a huge investment to gain that capacity. But south of us, getting down more into the plains around central Montana, we have a lot of coal fire plants that are shutting down. And there's a few giant wind farms that are going in there with those transmission lines being open for that. So we don't have a lot of interest in that development here, but as we go south, it definitely picks up.
Yeah, there's been some proposals for wind farms in this neck of the woods, but so far we've been successful in mitigating that, at least on the public lands. Okay, yeah. So big question from Ian Cook here. If you could implement 1 to 2 programs or incentives that are currently missing from our toolkit to prevent grassland conversion or get some of those not interested in conservation involved, what would you include? And what's holding back implementation of that?
So the overall funding for stockwater is one of our limiting factors. The complexity and design time of adding that stockwater through some of our agencies is definitely a slow process that takes some time incur some expense. But our most limiting factor on most of our infrastructure improvements is actually the contractors and people to do it. Across our entire area, we have on a great day 2 well drillers, on a usual day 1. And as you saw, we try to do 5+ a year, and the ones we have are both over 60 and nearing retirement. So the actual ability to install these practices can be one of the most limiting factors. So I think finding ways to incentivize the retention of new contractors would be huge. For a lot of the work we try to do, we looked into, we have some conifer encroachment issues as we go south towards the Missouri River breaks. We don't have access to conifer contractors on the scale, topography, terrain, and remoteness of the projects we have. So a lot of our work then is limited by just the people that can do it. And then funding to do it is always limited. And then the partner biologists and the people that work with ranchers to do it is another limitation that we're most close to being able to address. So I think a lot of the work to be done on the programmatic side of just facilitating the actions these programs want to see. I'm not sure if we're really missing incentives. We're just missing the ability to be able to deliver those incentives.
Yeah, and I would just add that the one major important ingredient is time. It really takes time to build trust and build partnerships, and that, the success of RSA in my book is growing out of all of that trust and partnership that was developed, basically since 2001 or so when it was founded. So it's been a long time coming. I think from the outside looking in, if you haven't heard of RSA before, it looks like they're just knocking it out of the park right out of the gate. And yeah, I think that's not the case. It's been a long, hard slog of trust building, conversations, just grinding through all that stuff to get people in a place where they trust each other. And now that we're there, it's, sort of the sky's the limit. So I guess that's one perspective.
And that's a good point to hit, Marissa. And like that slide I showed with all the different logos of our partners, it's rare that I work with a rancher that doesn't have issues with at least one of those organizations from some previous interaction. So I think RSA spends a lot of time being that gatekeeper of just letting ranchers know that we're working with those groups to make sure that it is a positive interaction. So that, like Marissa said, is something that takes a lot of time.
Okay, so comment on the book club choices. They seem peculiar. How much importance is placed on evidence-based rangeland management and conservation?
So I think RSA prides itself on being able to attract the weirdest ranchers around to their board. So our weird ranchers and weird partners are usually pretty good at throwing out weird books. But I think there's interest in that different perspective that I think is valuable to our group to make sure that we're not locked into just traditional thinking on how things can be done. So that willingness to try and be different, I think, is something that is beneficial to this group. So they've really tried to focus on books that are just a little outside of the traditional mindset of what we do as ranchers and conservationists. Most of our education events and things focus a little more on traditional concepts of ag economics or succession planning or things like that. We don't spend a lot of time as RSA presenting on evidence-based management. We tend to let our partners handle that. Most of our wildlife partners are pretty good at putting out wildlife type data. A lot of our extension and agency partners are pretty good at putting out research-based informational content. So we share that information, but we don't necessarily put a lot of our time into making more of that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is, RSA is a community-based collaborative. Science is not really their wheelhouse, although they rely on science and use science. And I think you said it exactly right, using the partners for that. And I would also say there's increasing interest in regenerative ranching and regenerative agriculture, whatever that means to you. And I think that's something that's really revitalizing the more progressive ranching community here. So that I think that's where some of these choices are coming from. Okay, Maggie says that ranchers up here in Saskatchewan don't seem at all interested in seeding cropland to native. Are you seeing more uptake of that? I think I always ask this question. Thanks, Maggie. Is cover cropping, trying to keep living roots in the soil, a step in the right direction for wildlife?
Yeah, so actually me and Marissa have a text thread right now about a project with this exact issue. Every situation is different and every need is going to be different. So I think it really relies on what does that producer view as their main problem. If they are facing basically a productivity crunch, they're obviously going to want more introduced for that higher production. If they are facing a length of season or a nutrition or an animal performance issue, I think that native seeding aspect is a lot easier sell and push. And then I think a lot of producers that have seen the benefit of how their cows do on their BLM allotments and native range and that kind of thing through especially droughty summers compared to how those cows do on droughted out introduced that do horrendously bad in drought years, I think is something that a lot of people recognize and see. So we do have a lot of people that come in and outright ask for native seeding. They like that diversity, they like that drought resilience, they like the predictability. Those native seedings, they don't have a lot of swing on a drought year to a good year. They're pretty stable, they're pretty reliable, and they're pretty high feed value. Where we see a lot of interest in introduce is spring and winter use, where people really just need some enhanced earlier growing grass, higher growing grass, or anything that they would like the option to be able to hay on good years. That's something that comes up fairly frequently. We try to work through it. Like I said before, we have 6 or 7 or 8 different options on seeding. So as long as time isn't an issue, it's usually we're able to find a way to do that. I guess my view, and Marissa will tell me I'm wrong here in a second, but my view is that any grass is better than no grass. So the content of that mix is less important than the fact that we're being helpful and trying to help that producer find ways to get better. And if we can keep finding ways for them to get better, I think they will become more aware of the different management options and how like that native species and diversity would help them overall.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong, Martin. I think back to my trust building, and you know, a large proportion of the projects that we do are just to build relationships with folks. So I think doing something that works for them in the short term, even if it's not 100% the best thing for wildlife, I think in a lot of cases can be a really good thing to do, because that relationship can develop into more of a two-way relationship where you might have more influence over future projects or as it develops. And you know, I think we tend to, as biologists, go straight to, oh, what's the species in the seed mix? You know, we focus a lot of energy there, and that isn't necessarily always the most important thing. But we do have to balance those things as we go forward.
Right, and for me, it's always important to remember like the economics. If we're taking cropland that they could lease out to a farming neighbor for $50 an acre and converting it to grass that's worth 25 in AUM, there's no reason that they wouldn't be asking for higher producing introduced that would be closer to the income, the opportunity cost that they would have to be able to lease that cropland instead of a lower producing native mix that goes down. I think that's the out front numbers that kind of every rancher knows. I think the behind the scenes numbers are that feed value and that risk of underperforming introduced species on drought years and adequately performing native species on drought years.
Yeah, and then Maggie specifically asked about cover crops too, and you know, I'd say we're not really in the business of doing cover crops just in a crop rotation, because that's not moving towards grass-based agriculture. But I will say we have been using them more and more in just the initial startup phases of a restoration. So Martin mentioned sometimes it takes 2-3 years for a native stand to establish, and putting in a nurse crop or a cover crop with that seeding can really give folks something to use in the first year or two, which a lot of times helps. Anyway, I guess a couple more questions here, and then we'll try and give folks a break before the next talk. Kevin asked, is there growing interest in long-term protection of rangeland through our work? How many easements or even 5 to 10 year commitments? Any negative comments from participants on those?
So we don't directly work in easements, but a lot of our partners do. So that's not a tool that our group is against in any fashion, but any of our projects are going to have basically like a habitat agreement that it's left in that habitat for a number of years, ranging, like Kevin said, from 5 to 10 to 20, depending on our partner. For the most part, on the United States side, when an easement is in place, it's perpetual. So there is some resistance from ranchers to sign up for a perpetual anything, but there's also a lot of success in those easements that are very, very kind of open-ended and management friendly and rancher friendly. Marissa's program works with those extensively, and we have dozens of ranches that take part in that program as a way to either acquire new property or transition property to a next generation. So it's a powerful tool. We're not dead set at promoting it. We work more on that habitat agreement as RSA, but we're very open to our partners working with people we work with on easements as part of our overall goal.
Yeah, and to the 5 to 10 year portion of that, Kevin, I think whenever we do the restoration and enhancement projects with folks under a Fish and Wildlife Service private landowner agreement, those are a minimum of 10 years. Some of them are 20, and that just basically is that they need to leave the grass or the habitat in place for that period of time. And then it's non-regulatory, it's totally voluntary agreement. So the only sort of punishment if they don't abide by that is that they're required to pay back a prorated amount of the cost share that they receive on that. So that's really sort of the only teeth. We're pretty committed to being completely voluntary and incentive-based, and it works well.
Yeah.
So let's see. Maggie asked about prescribed fire too. Do we do any prescribed firework? Thinking about Durock's talk yesterday. You mentioned conifer encroachment. Any comments on fire?
Yeah, so we'd like to. Fire is a very, very interesting thing, and especially in Montana. We've had some partners from other states come to Montana and ask why it doesn't exist here. One answer I was given that in Montana, as the person that sets the fire, you are ultimately liable for what happens, and that can impact your willingness to be involved in fire in any mention. And then I think just culturally, we have just a complete aversion to fire. So we're a ways away from, I think, people seeing the benefit of fire. We've had some projects in the last decade or so that have worked to do some like spring burns on little blue stem grass or crested wheat that I think people have found value in, but the support really isn't there for fire to be a widely used practice.
Yeah, I would say it also comes with some regulatory or administrative challenges as far as getting a certified burn crew together. I mean, there's just not a lot of those folks around to use, so resources are thin there.
And then so many of our ranchers that we work with, their operations are just checkerboarded between private and public land, where they would need to have basically concurrence from everyone involved, and that process isn't something that I think people have viewed as worth it to get a fire started.
Yeah, it would be something we'd like to see, but challenging for sure. Okay, so one more comment here from Tamara. I'm a bit surprised that the cost and availability of native seed isn't mentioned as a barrier to adoption. Does cost come up with your ranchers and farmers as a barrier?
So I will say, I think we have a better adoption of native seed seedings when the program is just paying for the seed and the rancher never knows what it costs. Because I used to work as an NRCS partner biologist, and in that program, ranchers would have to buy the seed and then be paid back. They were much less willing to buy a lot of expensive native seed even with that payment coming later, just because of the amount of cash it took out of hand, and the amount of overhead that it took away from that payment, making money on the back end. So the other funding mechanisms we use to do that native seeding just cover the cost of the seed, so that it's not a question or an issue.
Okay, I think I'm not seeing any other questions. Sasha or Carolyn or anybody, did I miss anything?
I think you're all good.
Okay, well, let's maybe take 5 minutes and do our poll, and then we'll take a short break. Does that work? I rushed past the poll this morning. We're not sure if we have the same audience or not as yesterday, and we wanted to ask you guys where you're from and who you represent. So can we run that now, Sasha? Just take a minute and let us know. Okay, thank you. Looks like we got Saskatchewan wins the representation. Montana's lagging. If you wouldn't mind sharing, if you're from one of the other areas in the US or Canada, type in the chat box where you're from. And then let's also ask them who they represent or who they're working for. Classification. All right, non-governments for the win. And thank you, producers who are attending. Okay, I think let's take a 5-minute break if folks want to have a stretch and go to the restroom and get a cup of coffee, and then we'll start at 10:10 with Diego. And you don't need to close your webinars, you can leave it open. We'll start to gather back here and get ready for heading north into Saskatchewan from Montana for our next local action example with South of Divide Conservation Action Program. Diego Steinecker is a plant ecologist and rangeland management specialist at SODCAP, which is an NGO that works in conservation of native prairies in Southwest Saskatchewan, so just north of the border from where I am right now. Diego obtained a bachelor's in science in biology at the University of Cordoba, Argentina, and a PhD in plant ecology at the University of Regina. Diego has more than 25 years of experience working on ecology, conservation, and management of temperate grasslands in South and North America. Prior to joining SODCAP, Diego was manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, PCAP, the associate director of the Canadian Institute of Ecology and Evolution, and a rangeland management specialist in central Argentina. So Diego, if you're ready, please take it away.
Good. Thank you, Marisa. Thank you for the introduction. And also thank you to Sasha, Caroline, Kevin, and Linda for organizing these workshops. The Transboundary Grassland Partnership, I think that is a great forum because ecological challenge clearly exceed political borders. So this forum is a great opportunity for cross-boundary funding and collaboration for grassland conservation. So thank you for this initiative. And I would like to start with one brief description of SODCAP. I don't know if you can see. Let me see. Yeah. By saying that SODCAP is a non-profit organization that, in partnership with other NGOs, government agencies, First Nation, ranchers, and industry, has been implementing actions over the last several years to restore and conserve native prairies in Saskatchewan. SODCAP was created in 2014 to lead the coordination and implementation of the action plan for multiple species at risk in Saskatchewan. SODCAP is just one of the several agencies delivering ecological programs in the south of the Divide area. Currently, SODCAP is under the co-executive direction of Kelly Williamson and Krista Todd, and boarding members of the SODCAP include board representatives from other NGOs, First Nations, producers, government agencies, and industry. With funding from multiple resources, we deliver stewardship programs that encourage producers to make species at risk priority in their management decision on their ranches. Thus, we can say that our slogan, providing habitats on working landscape, synthesize quite well the actions and goals, since we work very closely with local ranchers through multiple programs and agreements. Looking at the Transboundary map, our working area is located in the southwest corner of Saskatchewan, in the Milk River watershed. As Rachel Turnquist showed us yesterday in her presentation, the south of the Divide area is indicated as a priority place for the new Pan-Canadian approach. This area represents an important reservoir of grassland biodiversity, since more than 50% of the total land area remain as native prairie, compared with to the provincial average of less than 15. And this native prairie provide, of course, habitat for many species, including more than 20 species at risk that depend on these grasslands. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we work is Treaty 4 territory, so we pay all respect to the First Nation of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. More than 250,000 acres of native grasslands are currently under some type of SODCAP conservation agreement, both on private and public lands, involving right now 46 individual projects. Conservation agreements are long-term, 10 years, legally binding documents which incorporate recovery strategies and action plan developed by Environment and Climate Change Canada. SODCAP implements different types of agreement with landowners, but the process toward the implementation of this agreement is quite similar in all the cases. Communication and engagement of landowners is a first necessary step in the process to the implementation of conservation agreement. And that is because we need actually to reach and engage landowners and leaseholders who manage these lands. SODCAP makes outreach and extension through multiple activities and approaches, including social media. Melanie Topi is continually feeding our social media with really interesting information and news, so please follow us in Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also deliver electronic newsletter. We organize workshops, field days, annual general meetings, and among many others extension activities. But a very important outreach activities is the one-on-one kitchen table visit to producers that manage these prairies. Building relationship is key to deliver programs in rural communities. So, and then a strong relationship always helps to find the best way to improve and protect habitats. A second step toward the implementation of conservation agreement is a GIS analysis, mapping of soil, ecosites, topography, image, important and critical habitats for SAR. With that info, we identify potential land projects and we design the field assessments. Michelle Lanois from the Saskatchewan Minister of Environment, in a contract through Nature Saskatchewan, produce all our necessary maps and GIS analysis, which is really good. After all this first screening through image and maps, we proceed with the ecological assessment in the field to determine habitat health and to find ecological issues or problems to be approached in the conservation agreements. In some cases, we evaluate habitat targets for specific species. For rangeland and riparian health assessment, we use work guides developed by the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan. With all this baseline information, that is GIS, maps, field assessments, and other information from producers, we are ready to draft a habitat management plan for the conservation agreement. The negotiation process generally involves several meetings in order to develop management strategies and address environmental concerns, and also to agree with the producer goals and operation. The management plan is agreed is a draft and discuss it with external expert from the organization too. And then final agreement is finally signed when all the parties agree. The next step is, of course, the implementation of the activities specified in the habitat management plan of the agreement. I will show next some examples of these activities. Finally, we track and oversee the progress of these activities specified in the management plan of the agreement and address new challenge and opportunity as they arise. That will allow us to implement adaptive management to changing situation that always happen. We also track the success of the implementation of the management plan by using some ecological and economic metrics. With funding from different sources, SOTCAT delivered 3 main types of conservation agreement: results-based agreement, habitat management agreement, and habitat restoration agreement, which these have different characteristics and different approaches. As we know, conservation strategies may vary from single species approach to multiple species to ecosystem-based approaches. Each approach has pros and cons, but at the end, it will depend on the conservation goals. If our goal, for example, is to recover one species at risk, maybe the more effective approach may be a single or a multiple species. But if our goal is to recover a degraded habitat or to increase the provision of one ecosystem service, such as carbon storage in soil, then an ecosystem approach may be the more appropriate. The programs that SOTCAT delivered involve all these different types of approaches. I would like to show some examples of each type of conservation agreements. The first one is results-based conservation agreements. This kind of agreement focuses on rewarding producers for supplying habitat for a specific target species. The results refer to quantifiable habitat targets that producers can manage and over livestock production. These habitat targets for species at risk are based on the current state of knowledge and within the ecological potential for the range site. For example, we know that sage-grouse chicks rely on fork for food, and sagebrush are important for protection, to protect them for predators and hide nest. And studies show that the ideal values for these variables are, for example, for corps 7 to 8%, depending on overflow of upland sites. So with these habitat targets, we evaluate these results-based conservation agreement. That happened with each species. For spray pipit have, of course, different targets. Pipit need good amounts of litter, at least 360 pounds per acre. Grasses with intermediate height and large blocks of grassland, since they are sensitive to habitat fragmentation. We annually measure these target variables, and if the targets are met, then the producer receives a payment for that year. As an example, in 2018, we signed an agreement with 2 community pastures in southwestern Saskatchewan, which together add 160 acres of native grasslands and 50,000 acres of sage-grouse habitats. Within this area, designing as critical habitat for sage grouse. We randomly select 80 different points in both overflowed and upland sites. And in both kind of habitat sites, we measure the habitat target that I described before. This table just shows the result from the habitat assessment for one of the years of the project. I will not go on the details, but I just wanted to show you that in that case, the habitat targets for sage grouse were met or exceeded. So in exchange of achieving the wanted habitat targets, producers were rewarded with the financial incentives. Grass banks agreements are another type of results-based agreement, but in this case, the approach is for multiple species, unlike the previous one that I described in the community pasture, that the approach was for a single species. SUDCAP has been working together with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association, with local ranchers and with the Grassland National Park in this grassland project. The grass bank allows local ranchers to utilize the prairie grass within the national park boundaries at the reduced rate in exchange for producers achieving habitat targets on their own privately managed ranch. So local ranchers are managing grazing on portion, in that case, of the east block of Grassland National Park, and in their own private land, with the goal of achieving habitat target for, in that case, for 3 species, for sage grouse, spruce pipit, and chestnut color longspur, and that is doing through careful grazing across almost 40,000 acres. These are habitat targets for each species measured by SUDCAP under the coordination of Kelly Williamson in this case. The results shows that most of these variables reach the target. In some cases, the habitat targets were not reached, but are close. But the results also show that that the project, the habitat target have been increasing positively over the past 4 years of the project. So this was quite effective on the goals. Every year, the management team discuss with all the parties the strategies to achieve the habitat target for the next season, considering the outcome of the previous season. Ranchers benefit from the program when they meet the habitat target through the reduced grazing fee on Grassland National Park lands. There are many positive aspects for grass banks. Grass banking allows to have a community-based conservation plan that provides benefits for both the environment and the participant ranchers. The project helped to develop positive and productive relationship in the community surrounding the Grassland National Park, because the ranchers undertake conservation management on both the park lands and their own neighbor lands. The habitat for species at risk is expanded more than the Grassland National Park or the ranchers or that the ranchers could achieve alone. So that is another really positive aspect of grass banks. The project allows for Grasslands National Park also restoring grazing on landscape where it was excluded for more than 20 years. More than 20 grass bank projects have emerged across the US over the last 15 years, and there are a couple of examples in Montana and Alberta. A second type or another type of conservation agreement that SODCAP is delivering is habitat management agreement. In this type of agreements, are prescribed in contrast to the result-based agreements, meaning that we develop and agree with the producer or the land manager a management plan that the producer will follow. This kind of agreement may be addressed for a particular species or a group of species, but also may be directed to improve just range health condition or the ecosystem functioning, or to provide more any ecological good and service that they provide. Activities in management plans are generally related with management of grazing, but they could be also related with other actions such as control of invasive species, for example. This agreement considers payment compensation to the producer based on the cost of implementing the management plan, and may also include potential loss of opportunities. I will bring here as an example an agreement that we signed with a producer close to Mancora. This ranch have 7,000 acres of native grassland. Most of that has been designed as critical habitat for spray pipits. And as I showed before, an important step on the process for implementing a conservation agreement is the assessment of some habitat variables. We always count with the fantastic help of summer students for these evaluations. And from this assessment, we found that even when in the south block, we reach the landowner reached the habitat target for spray pipits, we have some problems, some issues in the north block of this ranch. In this paddock, we found areas with values far below or above the target range for spray pipit. And the cause of that was related with grazing. In this north block, is an unique 3,400 acres piece of grassland with only one source of water for livestock in one of the streams. So cattle almost don't reach the north portion of this paddock in hot summers. Thus, we plan and agree with the landowner some action to improve the management related with developing another source of water, when we develop one spring, and a new fence, along with the implementation of one rotational grazing system. We evaluate annually the impact of these measures and adapt those if it's necessary. In SODCAP, we are working not only in grassland but also in riparian ecosystems. With funds from Fisheries and Ocean Canada, we are implementing a project to promote the conservation of important riparian habitat for mountain suckers and other species in the Middle River watershed. Mountain soccer is a cool water species and prefers shallow and small streams. The target area include the Frenchman River and the Battle Creek system and tributaries creeks including Caron, Lone Pine, Balanche, and Conglomerate. After a CHIS and cadastral analysis to identify potential land projects and following our process for implementing conservation agreement, we contact and approach the landowners who manage land intersecting the target water course in order to engage them to enter into conservation agreement. Thus, with Krista Todd, we visit interested landowners to make a series of evaluation and riparian assessments at sites. We follow the riparian health assessment guide developed by the Prairie Conservation Action Plan. In this field assessment, we evaluate 12 different habitat attributes, including, for example, stream bank root mass protection, utilization of trees and shrubs, human disturbance and invasive species, and among other variables. A healthy riparian area has deep-rooted vegetation, minimal bare ground, and healthy shrubs where possible. Deep-rooted vegetation along the edge of the creek helps to maintain the bank in place, reduce sedimentation, and share the water, keeping it cool. But in some cases, we observe ecological issues and stream bank erosion, ladder and cutting bare ground, overuse of woody vegetation. And in these cases, we aim to develop agreements with the producer in order to find a way to improve that disturbed, this specific disturbed habitat. In many occasions, that is related with impact of overgrazing and trampling by cattle that impact the riparian vegetation, affecting the stability of the stream bank and overall the quality of the habitat. In this particular case, for example, the conservation agreement address remedial measures aimed to reduce the livestock pressure on the stream bank, like, for example, fencing a critical area, deferring grazing during critical growth periods, and provide enough stream water supply for cattle. We are currently developing habitat management agreement in different sites intersecting these target creeks, including the Nicatini First Nation Reserve. Another important partnership that has been results in great conservation agreement is our partnership with the Frenchman Wood River Weed Management Area. This weed management program works together with producers and rural municipalities to manage noxious weeds through prevention, education, early detection, and control measures, tackling two pathways of invasion, the Wood River and the Frenchman River. The programs involve invasive weed surveys over more than 500 miles of roadways were surveyed within 5 Saskatchewan rural municipalities. The purpose of these surveys is early detection of weeds since smaller and new patches of invasive species can be easily controlled or more easily. Invasive weeds observation were entered into the IMAP invasive database. This is a free access online database where organizations may enter and share the data on invasive species. Leafy spurge is quite problematic, as you know, weed originating from Eastern Europe that invade our native prairies. There are several options for leafy spurge control using herbicides like picloram, or biological control, or managing ruminants, small ruminants such as goats and sheep. The river is a major provider of spreading the leafy spurge in other areas. So sensitive sites like these riparian areas where we should not spread the herbicides due to the proximity to water are perfect for goats control. In this specific project, a grazer was contracted to bring goats to graze leafy spurge along a portion of the Frenchman River for several years. Several days during the season. Another way to control leafy spurge is by using flea beetles. Just last summer, we collect and release 25,000 beetles in 10 different sites of 5 different rural municipalities. The beetles, the adults, and particularly the larvae, feeds and damage the spurge roots, causing diseases for the plants and controlling in that way the weed populations. For more information and much more details on this program, please contact our weed specialist, Melanie Choppy. We are also providing financial incentive through conservation agreement to producers to have existing fence modified to reduce barriers to bronchor movement. Maintaining migratory roads is key to ensure dispersal and gene flow among bronchor populations. As you may know, bronchor evolve on open plains without vertical barriers, so they lack the ability to jump fence like deers, and crossing under the low barbed wire fence may produce injuries in their back, increasing stress, reducing fitness, and which can lead to infection and death. And the demonstrated solution is to replace the bottom barbed strand with a double strand smooth wire and adjust at 16 to 18 inches the minimum about the ground this bottom wire. This modification allows for bronchor to cross the fence by crawling under the bottom wire and while containing the domestic livestock. We focus in areas that were identified as bronchor migratory routes in some southwest Saskatchewan, following the studies carried out by Andrew Shakes and Paul Jones. This project is mainly funded by the U.S. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The last type of conservation agreement that SOLCAT promotes and supports are habitat restoration agreements. These are long-term agreements, minimum 20 years, signed between SODCAP and landowners, aimed to restore vegetation composition, structure, and functioning of native prairies on currently cultivated lands. For many of these parcels, cultivated lands, besides native prairies, native grasslands, create gaps in their movement. So restoring prairie in these areas help to create habitat corridors and allow species at risk to move freely. For that reason, we generally target sites surrounded by native prairie and critical habitats. In this kind of agreement, SODCAP provides the native seed mixes and technical support, and the producer in general is responsible for preparing the seed bed, the weed control when necessary, seeding the mix of the native species, and also the agreement may include the loss of opportunity associated with resting seeds, the seeded area up to 2 years post-establishment. So after the seeding, need to be rested for at least 2 years. A grazing management plan is always associated with these restoration plans. All these conservation agreements have proven to be effective in the retention and improvement of habitat attributes on native grassland. That is improving and maintaining habitat for wildlife and for the provision of ecological goods and service. However, these incentives may be not enough to protect the habitat from conversion. So we have some instruments for habitat protection that may be more efficient, such as, for example, conservation easement, land securement, legal assurances like environmental protection orders or any other legal protection. In that case, SODCAP is working in partnership with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation in a project intended to register conservation easement in privately owned native prairies. This project is coordinated by Tom Harrison, that is the general manager of the Stock Growers Foundation. Conservation easements are volunteer legal agreement between private landowners, the grantors, and in that case, the Stock Grower Foundation as a registered holder. Conservation agreement and are registered against the land title. Crop lands, crown lands with native grassland and critical habitats are generally protected from cultivations, but it doesn't happen with private lands. So therefore, easement will provide protection for private or deeded lands that already exist for crown lands. These easements will prohibit any breaking, cultivation, or conversion of the lands, but we will allow, however, some agricultural use of the land, such as grazing management activities. Other activities like weed control and hunting will be subject to an approved management plan. Currently, conservation easements that are held in Saskatchewan and in general are in perpetuity. However, the option exists to register a conservation easement for specific terms. In one recent survey study, we found that the vast majority, 85% actually, of the interviewed landowners in Southwest Saskatchewan consider more desirable term conservation easement than perpetual conservation easement. When asked about the reason of choosing term easement over perpetual easement, most landowners refer that they don't like the idea of locking the next generation into an easement. So stock growers will offer not only perpetual but also easement for a specific term, minimum of 25 years. Something important to mention is that conservation agreements, which may include measures to improve rangelands and habitat conditions for south, can be added on top of these conservation easements. So coming back, we can have in one even site a conservation easement on place to protect the habitat and any kind of conservation agreement to improve or retain the habitat. In this project, SOCAP specifically is exploring the interest and motivation of landowners to enter in conservation easement. For that, we conducted last year surveys to about 40 producers who own critical habitat for sage grouse. That is because stock growers has already secured funds from SARPAL to register conservation easement in greater sage grouse critical habitat. SOCAP will also work in the landowner engagement through our outreach and extension programs and in the ecological assessment. That these are important because will be used for the evaluation of the easement. So I will just finish thanking all our partners and supporters. Nothing of what we are doing could be possible without their support. And we also want to thank the ranchers, First Nation, and other stakeholders who manage these lands and play actually the main role in protecting and conserving biodiversity in these grasslands. So I don't know if we have time for questions.
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions, so please type them in. Okay, Maggie asks, why is burning prohibited on conservation easements when burning can provide suitable habitat for a number of species at risk? Unlikely, of course, that anyone will do a prescribed fire, but it seems like an odd contradiction to prairie ecology.
No, that is a good point, Maggie. I think that, well, actually the conservation easement is, not all the conservation easement will be the same for all the cases for all the producers, and will be some negotiation on that. And as you say, of course, prescribed fires are key on grassland ecosystems. Actually, the prevention of fires on grassland is a disturbance. So I think that is a good point.
I'll ask a question about your term easements versus the perpetual easements. How is the valuation of those different, or is it?
Well, that is another important point that you are mentioning. That is something that we are working with the stock growers to find the right value of this conservation easement. Initially, conservation easement values are related with the fair market values of the land, but this maybe is not the ideal way to value conservation easement, because fair market value is more related with agriculture potential of the lands. And so we sometimes many grasslands have not a great agriculture value, but have one important conservation value that is the important for conservation easement. So there are different options that actually stock growers, particularly Tom Harrison, is working on to find the right and the fair value for conservation easement, particularly for term conservation easement. That will depend, of course, on the term, on the period, on the number of years that will be assigned.
So the value does go up with the length of time.
Sorry?
The value of the easement does increase with the length of time of the easement. Maybe.
Yeah, should be. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, in the case of term conservation easement, that would be the case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca asked, the pronghorn wire system is simple and efficient. How many ranchers have adopted it, and how many miles of fences have been converted?
Well, that is a project that is, we just start with that. We were contacting and agreeing with some producers. We just started this year with this program, so we don't have too many projects in place for pronghorn fencing improvement. But we have some people that is interested on that. So if you know someone that is interested on modifying fence to improve pronghorn movement, please let us know. In general, we will prioritize areas that are under the pronghorn corridors, not in any area, of course. So yeah, if you have some contact, I think that Vicky was the question. Please let us know.
Okay, do you allow easement holders to be a part of your results-based agreements?
Yes, actually, that is one of the things that is interesting for conservation easement, that we can add to the top of the conservation easement any kind of conservation agreement, because sometimes conservation easements have some restrictions that, of course, are very good and effective to protect the habitat, but that not necessarily improve and provide the habitat for the species at risk. If we have a grassland that is already degraded with a conservation easement, we will protect that for conversion, but we will not maybe to improve the habitat conditions. So in that cases, will be great to add any kind of conservation agreement, like results-based or habitat management agreement.
Okay, thank you. So Jessica from Montana asked, I know it's an average taken in an area for a habitat prescription for a single species, but I fear by managing for specific species constantly, the dynamic nature of prairie is stagnated. How do you make sure these systems are available to fluctuate, or is that not considered?
Yeah, no, that is a good point. In generally, when we manage for one specific species, because the species have different habitat requirements, sometimes improving the habitat for a given species, we may have negative effects for other species that require a different habitat target. There are many studies on that sense. Just recently, I was reading one article that show actually the effect of habitat management for increasing habitat target for sage grouse and how that affects other species habitat attributes, and that is that is why actually now most of the organizations and even from the government, for example, Environment Canada, for example, through the PAN approach, is changing this single species approach to multiple species or even ecosystem-based approaches for conservation. Anyways, I think that for in some specific cases, I think that single species approach could be useful and effective too, because it's more efficient. If we want to improve one specific area for a given species, the best approach is a single species. But we have to be careful about that we can affect negatively other species.
Okay, thank you. Then Jessica also asked about your riparian work, and she didn't see a mention of using mock beaver structures or beaver dam analogs that are being discussed and used currently in the United States. She also saw that cooperators are allowed to do beaver management for some agreements. So what does beaver management mean? And then we're learning more and more that beaver activity is beneficial, and it appears that maybe this is missing.
That is a good point. We didn't have this specific problem with beaver management with the project that we are working right now, but that is something that we should consider in the case that appear that problem with beaver, because some landowners actually mention about that, and we have some limitations on that. We have to get the approval from Environment Canada for beaver management and for the World Security Agency. So the important thing that all these programs in general we consult with the government organization and other experts before to put in place this kind of project of agreements.
So when your agreements say beaver management is allowed, what does that mean?
Not necessarily is allowed. We don't have really that experience with beaver management because in the places that we are addressing now conservation easement in riparian areas, we have not that specific issue right now. So I don't know when that's happened, what we will do. I think that for sure we will consult with the Saskatchewan Minister of Environment to know what is allowed or not, but I'm not sure right now on that.
Okay, thank you. So Melissa asked, can you elaborate a bit on the kinds of things that are required or included in the management plans for your restoration projects?
Sorry, can you say again?
So elaborate on the kinds of things that are required or included in the management plans when you do restoration projects.
Yeah,
Feeding to grass.
yes, yeah, that is in any restoration project. Is not just seeding the mix of native species, but it's very important to have one associated management plan with this restoration project. So that is one important aspect, because when we talk with about restoration project, in general, we just consider the cost of related with seeds and with the seeding of the mix of native species, but we have always to consider the additional management for this restoration project that have a great cost, and in general is taken by the producer. For example, just from the beginning, they have to rest at least 2 years, will be 3, depending on the establishment of the new plants, to rest this area. So that have a loss of opportunity cost that should be considered in any restoration project.
Yeah, thanks, Diego, and thanks for a great talk. I think let's take another 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and see what's going on in Alberta. Thanks, everybody. Come back at like 11:11. I'll see you there.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Our next presentation is going to take us west for an innovative pilot, conservation market pilot project in Alberta, and presented by Lindsay Murfin and Bill Newton. So for the past 9 years, Lindsay has served as the general manager of the Western Stock Growers Association, which is a beef industry producer advocacy group that focuses on policy, land use, and property rights. Lindsay is driven by her passion for the success and sustainability of the agriculture industry, with a particular interest in leveraging the environmental benefits of agriculture systems. Lindsay has strong roots in both crop and livestock agriculture and holds a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. Outside of working, she's an avid foodie who loves spending time with her family in the outdoors. And Bill Newton, in 1983, Bill and his wife, Nancy, purchased bare land in the Spring Point district west of the Head Smashed-In Buffalo Jump World Historic Site. They have been fortunate to be able to grow that land base into a viable standalone ranching operation. They are delighted to have their 2 grown children working with them on that operation, and proximity to their grandchildren is a great bonus. Bill has worked on multiple boards and committees, including the Western Stock Growers Association, Livestock Identification Services, Alberta Livestock Industry Development Fund, ABMI Ecosystem Services Stakeholder Advisory Council, Lethbridge Community Foundation, Porcupine Hills Stock Association, and UCVM Dean's Stakeholder Advisory Council. He has a strong desire to achieve recognition for the full suite of ecosystem goods and services provided by managed rangelands, and is a strong believer in property rights and free markets. He has great respect for the men of vision who preceded him in recognizing and protecting the truly sustainable grazing-based production system that provides the range of ecosystem goods and services, including food, that are required by a healthy society. So thanks so much, Lindsay and Bill, for being here with us. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Marissa. As mentioned in the introduction, my family and I ranch here in southwestern Alberta on Treaty 7 lands, and in fact we are immediately adjacent to the Piikani Nation with our operation. We share fence lines. The Western Stock Growers Association is actually an organization that's 125 years old this year. The Western Stock Growers slogan is the voice of free market environmentalists. So it's not surprising that we were interested in taking the lead on this pilot project. This is very much a progress report on a pilot project. So there's a lot of things that are not finished in what you're going to see, but we hope to introduce you to some innovative ideas and approaches towards grasslands conservation. A lot of this, and certainly my own interest in particular, comes from local observations. So 125 years ago when Western Stock Growers was formed, there was, almost all grassland in our part of the world. And in that 125 years, there's been a huge amount of conversion, and that continues today. And I know that we do have market approaches towards avoiding that. Things like easements, where the landowner either receives tax concessions or payments or some combination thereof, are a form of a market approach to grassland conservation. And they've been somewhat successful, but they tend to preserve very small areas of grassland relative to the big picture in perpetuity. And what we're going to present is an attempt to conserve much larger areas in 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, 20-year increments that eventually lead to a long-term conservation. This project was initially funded by Alberta Innovates, a grant from Alberta Innovates, and is being led by Western Stock Growers Association with assistance from the Ecoservices Network. We first met in May of 2020, and we are reporting now on what we've achieved since then. We have a fairly diverse stakeholder committee guiding the project. That committee has biologists, municipal councillors, reeves, has someone from the Food Water Wellness Foundation, which is pursuing security in all of those three areas, food, water, and wellness. We have forage specialists, ranchers, and so that's kind of who the committee is that's guided the project. And our objective is to design a market-based approach to grassland conservation and to make ecological goods and services markets more mainstream than they have been to date. Next slide, please, Lindsay. So some of this that we're going to talk about today comes from presentations we've given previously. One was a report to our Western Stock Growers membership. And I use this slide there. The picture is actually lifted from the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve's website. So the Tallgrass Prairie at one point covered 170 million acres, and there's very little of that left now as natural grassland. But the statement there comes from a neighbor of ours who used to cut hay with a team of horses about 20 miles west of Highway 2 in southern Alberta, so in the grassland part of the foothills. And he would tell me, and this was from the 1930s and 40s, that they would be cutting wild hay, native grass for hay, with teams, and the wild strawberries were so thick that by the end of the day, the horses' pasterns would be red from the strawberry juice created when they stepped on the berries. And so to me, that's a picture of the horses' pasterns painted red, but it's also a picture of an incredibly vibrant ecosystem with diversity and high functioning water cycle and energy cycle, nutrient cycle, and all of those factors coming together to produce this, what was at that time a very common ecosystem across the Tallgrass Prairie area. And of course, we know that we've lost a lot of that, and even where we still have native grasses intact, we may not have quite that high a level of functioning of that ecosystem anymore. So that was sort of what we think we might be able to achieve, and maybe that's our goal, is to work towards that sort of a functioning ecosystem on our grasslands. The next slide, please. So this production of these ecosystem services benefits that are the direct and indirect contributions and benefits that well-functioning ecosystems provide to society. The production of those things is not by accident. When we change our land management, we change the suite of ecosystem services that come off of that land. And so their production is the result of high intention and sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution, and it represents a holistic choice of a whole lot of alternatives that the land manager has in front of them. And these are difficult choices because finance always comes into it. The profit opportunity, or the profit requirement, really is what we should call it, to manage lands has to enter the picture, and currently grasslands produce so many of these ecosystem services that are just provided to society and consumers for free, and we sell the cattle that come off of that as our only source of income. And as a result, we continue to see grasslands converted to other uses in many cases because the financial returns are higher there. So that's what has driven some of the principles we'll talk about in our pilot project, and some of the ideas for how we can achieve a revenue stream to working grassland landscapes that helps to level the playing field with other both sectors of agriculture and other land uses, whether that be rural, residential, or industrial, or even renewable energy projects. Next slide, please. So we know some cold hard facts about grassland. It's no surprise to anyone on this seminar that grasslands provide a wealth of ecosystem services with high biodiversity and effective water capture, storage, and purification, and really good carbon store, and the only way they could become a really good carbon store is if they have active sequestration. And certainly we've already heard today about some, their benefits in terms of wildlife habitat, including species at risk and soil health. The pictures to the right of the screen there are actually on opposing ends of our ranching operation, one just to the north and one just to the south, from different landowners, neighbors of ours. But the contrast is very significant, and it basically represents the ideological poles, opposite poles of these two landowners. One who is looking at a sustainable long-term system with probably lower dollar return initially, but very high ecosystem functioning, good soil health, a diversity of plants, and you don't see the animals in this picture, but he's a grazier, and lots of wildlife habitat there, obviously. The other land manager has made their decision to convert this little corner of what was native grassland adjacent to a cultivated crop, and they've made that for financial and operational reasons. They needed to straighten out some of the lines to use some of their guidance systems more effectively, probably reduce overlap. They're probably actually going to reduce some of their fertilizer usage and whatnot. But what are they giving up when they do that? Well, to start with, probably 30% of the stored carbon there is going to be released. So we realize that there are drivers in these landscape in these land management decisions that are at all. Some very strong financial rewards, some very strong aesthetic rewards, but how do you balance those things out? Next slide, please. So this slide, I actually was just traveling one day this summer, and this is west of Calgary. The smoke is coming from a gas plant that had to flare that day, probably for safety reasons, and so not a very pretty picture, and it encapsulates a number of grassland conversion entity or situations here. There's the pipeline scars in front of the flare. There's obviously a highway that I'm traveling along. There's vehicles and industrial uses and residential uses, and all of these have contributed to the loss of what was once this huge grassland. And they also have not stopped. We continue to build. We continue to convert grasslands, and I guess that's one of our drivers, is trying to stop that trend with this pilot project. Next slide, please. So that last slide is an example of physical conversion of grasslands, but I think we should introduce this term of functional conversion as well. So this is actually a picture. There's a straw hat in the left-hand part of the picture. This is a picture taken on a grassland that has not been grazed for 10 years. And over time, the grassland deteriorates. Certainly the grassland functions deteriorate in the absence of grazing. This is partly because of this idea of the rumen as the rainforest in a brittle environment. Certainly a lot of Saskatchewan, a lot of the areas we've talked about today are really towards the extreme side of brittleness on a scale, and that just refers to the frequency and duration of precipitation, the temperatures, the humidity. So if you imagine a rainforest with plants growing and very frequent precipitation, very high humidity, very warm temperatures, the microorganisms that actually function to recycle the plant materials have no problem working directly on those plant surfaces and causing that decay and creating the nutrient, or completing the nutrient cycle. But in a brittle environment, and such as in this picture, the microorganisms, it's too dry for them to survive there on the surface of those leaves. And so those plant material actually just oxidizes over time rather than being broken down in this cycle of life by microorganisms. But if you add a ruminant to this brittle environment, a ruminant that bites off the grass material and ingests it into this warm, moist environment called a rumen, then the nutrient cycle is completed very effectively. So next slide, please. While we heard earlier about how grass is essential to the cattle industry, I would argue that cattle are essential to the grass industry as well. Grasslands are disturbance-dependent ecosystems, and the disturbances historically have been fire and grazing, and we have already recognized how difficult it is to use fire anymore. So I would suggest that grazing becomes the management of grazing becomes an even more important factor in creating appropriate disturbance for these grassland ecosystems. I'm proud that we are ranching just west of Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, a World Historic Site. And the grass-based economy in this region has a history of 12,000 years of sustainability. But the conversion continues around us based on market forces. Next slide, please. So the pilot project looked at developing a market-based framework to conserve grasslands. And there are certainly some challenges and limitations with that. There have been previous attempts and the easements that we talked about a bit earlier suffered some of these. It's very difficult to get scale in the easement approaches. The awareness, there's very limited awareness of buyers and sellers, and they don't understand or don't know about the various payment programs, and certainly I found it educational even this morning just listening in to some of the things that are going on. I was vaguely aware of some of them, but there's a lot of different approaches to grassland conservation. The flexibility has been a huge barrier, I would suggest, to sellers into this marketplace, to have ranchers sign in perpetuity agreements hasn't been hugely successful at scale with large uptake. If you actually look over at some of the carbon, the compliance markets around carbon, the rules there on unique and additional and verified and permanent are real barriers to someone coming into that marketplace. The costs for a market for grassland conservation need to be practical. They can't be extreme. And so the transaction costs in some of our previous attempts at environmental service markets or carbon reduction markets in Alberta, that most of the revenue ended up in the hands of the aggregators and not the actual landowners who are implementing the practices. We have other instances where best management practice implementation costs are so high that ranchers in particular just shy away from them, and perhaps this business of the cost of native grass seed in restoration projects might be an example. The measurement of ecosystem services is a difficult area. We have indicators that are becoming better understood, but are not fully understood, and the fact that different market programs use different measures for similar objectives has been a complicating factor. And then certainly one of the barriers to uptake by land managers has been unrealistic expectations in terms of contract lengths and expectations to achieve outcomes outside of the landowner's control, or sometimes expectations that have nothing to do with the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please. We have heard many times from both buyers and sellers in a conservation or ecosystem services marketplace that they want outcomes-based programs. They prefer them to protocol-based programs. So that's one of the principles that we tried to include in this framework for a grasslands conservation marketplace. So our principles became that the market is voluntary, with the flexibility to potentially incorporate compliance market buyers. And to be clear, a voluntary marketplace is a seller offering something in terms of grassland conservation, and we have some ideas around that I think Lindsay will get into deeper. But a buyer taking that on not because they're trying to meet their carbon emissions caps or their biodiversity caps, they're buying it because they think it's something that is in their interest as well to have supported. And if we look at the huge expressions of net zero by 2030, by 2050, by many large corporations, we don't think that that's going to be achieved through the compliance market on carbon. And the Wilmot in Australia, Wilmot Cattle Station, selling their, and they did call them carbon credits, they called them carbon credits plus, to Microsoft is an example of a voluntary market. That transaction did not qualify under Australia's carbon reduction protocols, but it still happened. So this is the kind of market that we are looking for. Our transactional costs and the entire project has to be cost effective with low transaction costs and the majority of the revenue going from the purchaser to the land manager and not too much taken up in the middle. And we see some approaches out of Australia now that are mimicking that or that are demonstrating that. Needs to be an efficient approach where buyers achieve their objectives in terms of sustainability, leveling the playing field with other interests in other interested parties in land and land management. They need to achieve that without too much operational burden in terms of implementation of the projects at the farm level. It has to be a trusted and credible system and based on science and observations and measurements where possible, and needs to be an outcome-focused market that, as I mentioned earlier, that goes beyond payments for just best management practices or protocols, but actually focuses on what is happening on the land. Needs to be adaptable, and we certainly understand how science and technology are continuing to advance, and monitoring systems are continuing to advance. So we need to be able to incorporate additional knowledge as it becomes available and practical to implement. Needs to be simple so that we have user interfaces that are clearly understood by both buyers and sellers, and communication tools that are well understood. And we think it needs to be innovative because the approaches so far have not stopped the conversion of grasslands. So we've got to try something new, I guess I suggest. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to hand off to Lindsay here. Certainly I will participate in trying to answer questions, but Lindsay, if you can take it from here, thank you.
Yes, for sure. Thanks, Bill. So this is what we came up for, the components of our market framework. And it's pretty straightforward. The seller produces a product which is assessed, measured, evaluated, verified, registered, and then sold, in a nutshell. The grassland seller are the farmers and ranchers who supply the grassland benefits, the ecosystem services under their management. The index calculator is a discovery tool that we came up with, used to identify and calculate a weighted combination of ecosystem service assets in a standardized way. It'll go through verification, where the process of authenticating ecosystem services and biodiversity benefits. The registry is a system that issues, tracks transfers, and retires indexes in the exchange. And then the buyers would be the investors in the conservation exchange who pay for and benefit from the ecosystem services. So I'm just going to go into the index part of our framework right now. One of the hardest things that we did with the advisory committee was tackling the definition of what we are selling, defining the product. Essentially, what we're selling is the management of a specified parcel of land for a period of time. To differentiate between various grasslands and to allow for comparison to converted grasslands, we landed on the idea of a weighted index to bring the scientific measurables that we currently have, bring them forward to a fungible entity. So under the index, we have these indicators that, that feed into the index. And they're listed there: biodiversity, landscape connectivity, water filtration, water storage, soil aggregate stability and soil health, and then other stewardship and cultural considerations, because ecosystem services are a result of management. So getting into the indicators in more detail, they're used because the ecosystem services benefits are hard to measure. Over the last decade or more, there's been lots of scientific work on evaluating ecosystem services that we have used to help us measure what could be traded in our grassland market. And we're using a combination of model data and real field data. So with biodiversity, we're using the intactness index from ABMI, and it is verified through a ground truth site visit, which includes georeference photos being sent back to ABMI. On top of that, we're also using ABMI's landscape connectivity index to round out the biodiversity category on our index. Underwater, we're looking at nutrient loading modeled by ABMI, and we're looking at water infiltration, which is ground truths, and it's also done at the Cara Soil Lab. And water storage, we're looking at the potential shown in water storage capacity with total wetland area. So really with these indicators, we're trying to measure or ascertain the efficacy of the water, the mineral, the nutrient, and the energy cycles on the site. And then we're also layering on top of that the succession of the ecosystem, which includes the people. For soil health, we are using soil aggregate stability, organic matter, bacteria to fungal ratio, and microbial respiration in soil sampling. And for management, we're doing a producer evaluation that touches on the recreational activities and opportunities that are offered, the opportunities for Indigenous traditional use, intergenerational knowledge, the use of regenerative agriculture practices, and continuous improvement in their management, or the drive for continuous improvement in their management. So with the indicators, many of you may have already noticed that we did not include carbon in the index. We don't have a carbon measurement. This was something that we went around and around on, and finally decided not to do a direct carbon measurement. And there's a few reasons for that. The regulatory side of the carbon market is what most people are familiar with, and it takes away from the voluntary nature of our market framework. There's a ton of work out there underway to measure and market carbon. We didn't want to get into the areas of duplicating anything that's going on, and we didn't want our pilot to be held back while we're waiting for these protocols and processes to be pushed to the point where they can be used in a market. And we also didn't want to preclude our producers from participating in a different carbon market by including it here. So our sellers can sell their ecosystem services here and also participate in a regulated carbon market if they want. So I mentioned that the index is a weighted combination. And so this shows the weightings of each of our categories. It's 30% in biodiversity, 30% in soil health, and 30% in the water, and then 10% in the culture and stewardship management portion of the index. And how we came about these weights is we looked at the availability of data, the accuracy and the confidence that we had in the science behind it, and what we thought the relevance or importance to the buyers would be. So out of that, this summer we ran some test sites to test our index and the verifications to see how it would come out at the other side. And we did do some tweaking of the index and some of the indicators and some of the weights of the indicators. But out of the other side, we came out with, this would be like a catalog listing for the different sites. So this is one site that would show up, and so the buyers would see pictures, and as the catalog develops into a website or an app, we think we could maybe include some drone footage and really show the bidders what they're looking at in real life. It's include with a description of the site, and then the overall index number is at the bottom. And coupled with that, in the catalog, you would see their complete index score. So the indicators broken down and the weighted score for each of our categories: biodiversity, water, soil health, and the culture and people. That's just a list of our verifications that we have for each indicators. So it's coupled with remote sensing, the site visit with the georeference photos, and the in the field samples, rapid assessment in the field, and soil samples at Cara Soil Labs to back it up. So next steps, Bill mentioned that this is a pilot and we haven't totally completed getting this market to a reality. Right now, the index is based on the metrics and models that scientists have been working on for decades, but we also recognize that science is always improving and it's always evolving. So we're committed to ensure that the framework always uses the best science available. And we're always on the lookout on how we can improve our indicators and make them really strong so that we can maximize the confidence in the framework. And there's other parts of the market framework that we're working on, but they're not complete. Solidifying the verification, for example, and creating the registry. We have a company called Silvacom who is working on the user interface for the registry, which will track the indices and the sites as their contracts are sold and retired. And really excited on the progress that's going on that. And Grasslands Capital X has to be run under a sustainable business model. That's what's going to run the exchange. Right now, the vision is for the exchange to run like a Kijiji type model, where you have an easy accessible catalog of what is available, and it marries the ability to directly connect the buyers and the sellers, as opposed to like an Amazon, which is more of a middleman type model. And the exchange entity will have to set out things like baseline contracts and offer contract support services for the buyers and the sellers. And we're wading through all the ins and outs and implications of that. And as we go forward, looking at all these next steps that we have to go through, we are looking for partnerships that can help us further the market and then can help us fill in the gaps. Bill mentioned in his start, the advisory committee. Building an outcomes-based market framework is really very difficult. And we couldn't have done it without this advisory committee. I've listed them all here. The biological index that we came up with appears to have considerable appeal and potential with those that we have consulted with on both the buyer and the seller sides. And we are confident that the pilot will highlight where we need to make improvements and where we need to focus to make a real grasslands conservation market a reality. And also need to acknowledge those who help us make it happen. We're extremely grateful for the financial knowledge and technical support of Ecoservices Network, Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, Alberta Innovates, and ECCC. And with that, I feel like I ran through that pretty quickly, but that also gives us time to take any questions.
Well, thanks so much, Lindsay and Bill. That was great, and what a cool project. So thanks for sharing with us. We do already have one question from Melissa. So what do your organizations think about rewilding bison for grassland conservation? Is that at odds with your goals?
It's certainly not at odds with our goals at all. Our goals are to conserve grasslands. We think that we need grazing animals on them to do that. I think we need to be really careful that we don't oversimplify that. So rewilding by using bison would, in my opinion, require rewilding by adding predators and fire and hunting to create the management that the bison are going to require and that they underwent in pre-settlement cultures. So, you know, I'm not sure that it's as simple as just reintroducing bison. I think it's much more complicated than that. But our goals are to drive the ecosystem functioning, and we strongly believe that that requires a grazing animal.
Okay, thanks very much. Elizabeth asked, what kind of qualifications do the rapid assessment folks have?
Lindsay, do you want to take that?
Oh yeah, I can take that. This year, for the purposes of the pilot, we did hire a summer intern. He's lived in the industry his whole life, so he does know what he's looking at. He doesn't have any certifications, but that was also something that we brought up with some of our buyers, and we have to look into what's acceptable for verifications in terms of qualifications, but at the same time, you walk a fine line. Like, verification by a professional could get really expensive. So maybe we need to look at just as a short certification. We're trying to keep the transaction costs here, and we've seen in the past verification is the largest part of transaction costs, and it is a huge barrier. So we need to explore all of the ways we can to address that barrier.
Great, thanks. Okay, so Jennifer says, great presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about the traditional and indigenous cultural use as an ecosystem service benefit?
Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about that. It's that whole group of ecosystem services that include aesthetics and cultural ecosystem services. So these landscapes, you know, just the viewscape is considered in assessments, and then whether or not there are still plants there that have been historically been used by indigenous cultures, whether they are still using them. This component of the index also includes things like, is there intergenerational knowledge? Is the land manager participating in learning more about perhaps regenerative agriculture or other practices to implement to drive the ecosystem function? So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Robert wants to know, how many producers are you expecting for the pilot?
The pilot is very limited. Our funding was not great, not huge, and our timelines are we're coming to the end of the Alberta Innovates funding timeline. So I think we did 8 different candidate sites, 8 or 9 as our pilot sites. That's for the project.
Yeah, and on top of the pilot sites, which we're using as examples for application of the index and verifications, we did present this several times to producer groups. So to increase the awareness, and that's how we got just the general support for the ideas.
And I should clarify that the pilot sites, like, producers nominated 1 or 2 or 3 quarter sections, but those producers all have much larger operations than that. It was just so that we had a specific geographic location to go and apply our index onto, and without huge cost that would be incurred by, going and looking at 5,000 acres instead of 500 acres.
Okay, Benjamin asks, is the goal to conserve existing high functioning grasslands or to restore degraded lands, perhaps under annual crops?
I think the goal is to achieve the ecological outcomes of high functioning grasslands, and to recognize that in some cases that's already present, and in other cases it will require restoration. So I think we can achieve both objectives here. If we took across our pilot sites, and we didn't have time to present them all, but we had some who had a lower index score, I can't remember, a 56 or something like that, as compared to the 91 that you saw. And the producer with the 56 might try to enter the market saying, I am going to do this restoration that I think will improve my score to 76 over a period of 20 years. The producer who has the 91 score, he has limited upside potential in our index. So he might enter the market saying, I'm going to continue to manage this to maintain a score of 91. One of the initial things that we thought about was taking the index score and comparing it to nearby cultivated lands or developed lands, residential lands. But unfortunately, we don't have the data from those lands, and the data is not publicly available. So that's why we couldn't use that as just selling the difference between this land and something else.
Hey, great, thanks. So who do you envision as major buyers? And I'll add to that. That comes from Tom Harrison. Just curious on the timings. When somebody would buy one of these pieces of land, what would be the time frame on that purchase as well?
By the time frame, do you mean how long would the agreement last, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, we envision this all being quite negotiable. In our pilot project, we had the fellow who was considering offering the major restoration projects, saying he would like that over a 5 or 10 year contract. He needed more money up front to achieve those the changes in his management. The more avoided conversion type contracts might be a 20-year contract. We don't think that we can interest sellers in really long-term contracts, and we hope that the whole food production system shifts over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, so that there isn't as much demand for grassland conservation, that it's already become the preferred choice from a market approach.
So who would you envision then as the major buyers?
Well, we think that the buyers could be extremely varied. So we might have buyers who are actually in the food production system, and Nestle and others are committing to net zero, to regenerative agricultural practices. Perhaps the Cargills and Nationals and JBSs of the world who are in the meatpacking industry are going to, and I think they already are making commitments to reduce their certainly their carbon footprint. And while Lindsay talked a little bit about why we chose not to focus solely on carbon, we think that what we focus on reflects good carbon storage, right? So if we have a highly functioning water cycle and nutrient cycle and energy cycle, that reflects soils that have a lot of carbon stored in them. And so we are probably headed towards the regenerative agriculture model. Well, in fact, I'm sure we are headed towards the regenerative agriculture model with reduced synthetic inputs and all of those things in achieving high scores on our indicators.
Okay, Rebecca asked what the acronym ABMI stands for, and Sasha actually answered that, Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. And then Diego asked, he asked about the marketing plan, basically. So in general, the value of a product depends on the demand and the buyers. If it's more in demand, the higher the price. So are you thinking of including a marketing plan associated with this product?
We definitely need a marketing plan, and we are working with some agencies to develop that. I fully agree that the price will depend on supply and demand. One of the things that we're considering is, and Lindsay referred to it, but Kijiji type model. But what if we just created a catalog of products available? You saw a brief example of that, but you could expand the pilot candidate sites into this landowner has this available for sale. Might be a 5,000 acre property that is 90% native grassland that is adjacent to a large block of undeveloped area that is native grassland. So you can bring in the contiguous components of this thing, and it'll have habitat suitable for this species or that species. All of that can be entered into a catalog that buyers can just preview and decide which properties they may be interested in.
Okay, great. Ian asked, what would be the largest barrier to scaling this approach?
The paradigm shift, I would suggest, from a regulated compliance market approach, or even a charitable funding approach, to actually a direct market transaction between buyers and sellers. So if we look at the current market approaches, the Nature Conservancy in the United States, Nature Conservancy Canada here, there are others, Southern Alberta Land Trust Society, Ducks Unlimited. They depend largely on charitable donations and government funding to drive their market, their purchases in the market. And we're proposing a direct exchange between buyers and sellers. So the paradigm shift is probably the thing to overcome, and then to scale it up, we think it could be scaled right across North America at a minimum.
Okay, one last question from Tom Harrison. I noticed the culture and people are weighted relatively low. Is that correct? Given that access might be a treaty right, are you looking to the federal government to be one of the buyers?
We are not looking at the federal government to be one of the buyers. And yeah, I don't know that people and culture are rated low. They're at 10%. It's a very difficult thing to measure, for one thing. And if we have this functioning ecosystem, the benefits flow to all people. So yeah, I'm not sure how we deal with access and treaty rights. It's well beyond my legal wisdom. So I would have to leave that alone, I think. We have a system of land titles in this province, and certain rights have been included with those titles, and so if the courts want to sort that out, I guess they can go at that. But really, our major difference is that we are taking a for-profit approach to grassland conservation as compared to a not-for-profit driving it, right? And so we think that the marketplace should recognize and society should be willing to pay for the ecosystem benefits, ecosystem service benefits that they are utilizing. And so that's our, I suppose, the major difference between us and what else is going on.
Well, I thank you so much for your time. That's really interesting stuff, and look forward to hearing more in the future about how it goes.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to present it.
Yes, thank you so much.
So now, Sasha, I think, do we have a closing slide or two here? So that concludes our program for today, guys. Thank you very much for attending. We'll be back tomorrow with Indigenous perspectives for a final day. And I just wanted to remind everybody of the website where you can find more information about the Transboundary Grassland Partnership. If you're interested in engaging more and participating at any level, we very much encourage you to do so. Let me check my other reminders here. Anything else I need to say? Oh, and I want to remind you that there'll be a feedback survey sent to you. I think it's sent out every day if you participate in more than one day, and you're more than welcome to fill that out every day or wait until the end to fill it out if you'd rather do that. We welcome all of your feedback. And we will be back at 9 o'clock Mountain Time tomorrow. So thank you very much for your time and attention.